decide. But for now, let's continue our discussion and bring in from Delhi Mujib Mashal, the South Asia Bureau Chief for the New York Times. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Give us your snapshot of where things stand in terms of the potential for ongoing tit-for-tat responses, or whether there is at least a pause for now.
Well, it's still quite a moving situation right now. Although the Indian government and the Indian armed forces have essentially claimed that they've achieved their objective, that they've struck 9 locations in Pakistan. What has happened since then is a bit of a gray picture that we're trying to piece together. There have been reports of a couple aircraft being down on the Indian side of the border. Information on whose aircraft those are, how they were down, are very, very sketchy at this point. So that what those aircraft are, if they're Indian aircraft that are being down, could indicate what the next steps in this escalation could be. If Pakistan comes out and says that it struck back in the process of the Indian military action, it could get us to a place where this may have been the extent of the escalation. But at this point, it is hard to tell, because Pakistan had promised that whatever action India takes, they would respond in kind. And we just don't know what the extent of the Pakistani response so far has been.
Yeah, I guess one Pakistani official had suggested they downed 5 aircraft, which was clearly a message that had reached my prior guest, Dr. Huma Bakri, a professor of international relations in Karachi. Either way, from what we do know for certain and what you kind of can piece together there in Delhi, put into context the scale of the military action we've seen over the last 12 hours relative to the last decade or so between these two countries.
Well, it feels much larger than previous military action, not just in the number of sort of locations that India targeted, but also that it targeted a couple locations in Punjab, sort of a province in mainland Pakistan. There have been Indian retaliatory fire in parts of sort of a disputed area of Kashmir or further away from sort of central Pakistan. But the fact that they've hit, in Punjab, that is an element of how big a response this is compared to, say, 2019 or 2016, when India, after previous terror attacks, India sort of went after locations in Pakistan. So just the number of locations that India has targeted, but also the fact that they've targeted inside Punjab. But then again, the context of this recent terror attack in India needs to be taken into factor, because this was a horrific attack. All those killed were civilians. They were killed in a very gruesome manner, where they were identified for their religion and targeted for that. So there was enormous pressure on the Indian government to respond in a way that was bigger than its previous responses to attacks on its soil.
I'm interested in your take that you'll know well, being at the New York Times, in what was done in 2019 by the US to try and ease the tensions. Of course, that was under Trump's first administration, and some suggest he and Mike Pompeo, who's the Secretary of State at the time, did a lot to diffuse tensions. What did they do? What are you expecting them to do this time?
Well, there's actually an account that Mike Pompeo wrote in his book, that he was woken up in the middle of the night when the escalation happened, and he had to call both the Indian side and the Pakistani side, because both sides were telling the Americans that we think the other side is moving their nuclear weapons. So the US sort of had to calm down both sides and say, listen, this is not going to go the nuclear direction. But the other factor in the 2019 escalation was that Pakistan had used an American-supplied F-16 plane to down an Indian, plane that was Russian-supplied. So the Indians were saying, Pakistanis have breached the agreement that they have with the U.S., that these weapons, these sort of planes, the F-16s, should not have been used against us. The U.S. had provided these F-16s only as for Pakistan to use, as counter-terror. So that created an awkward reality for the U.S. to get involved as well. And what the U.S. played a role in was because the pilot of that Indian aircraft that had been shot down was captured by the Pakistanis. And sort of the accounts that I've heard from diplomats is that the U.S. tried to make sure that pilot, it was a miracle that, he was alive and he had, landed safely after his aircraft went down. But the U.S. played a role in returning that pilot to India swiftly, and that helped sort of calm down the tensions a little bit.
Really interesting to get that added perspective. In terms of the timing, maybe this is a sort of ridiculous thing to bring up, but I'm just interested if you've heard anything where you are about why India struck when it did. There's obviously some interest in this, given that just yesterday India was announcing a trade deal with the United Kingdom. Are they totally random and unrelated in terms of the timing?
I think, those are random and unrelated. But if we think back to 2019, India took about 12 days, I think, if I remember correctly, to strike back. This time it's been about 2 weeks. One main factor in India's calculation is that there were fumbles in its 2019 retaliation, which kind of exposed India's military and the weaknesses of its military. In the years since, they've poured a lot of money into, starting the modernization of its military. So this time around, and in those 5 years since, 6 years since, India almost went to war footing with China. So this time around, it had to be very careful in what targets it chooses and how it executes, its mission to make sure it doesn't further expose a military that had fumbled last time. Because this time it wasn't just Pakistan that was watching, it was also China, because China remains in a very tense relationship with India. So the timing of why India took so long probably has to do with making sure they were very confident of what mission they were carrying out, and sort of the success of that to make sure they reduce the mistakes of a military that's been under scrutiny for a long time.
Just finally, you kind of alluded to it there, but what is the state of each of the two countries' military as things stand? I read that they've both been modernized. You just mentioned it since 2019. If you're able to put aside the nuclear weapons that both countries have, which of course we can't, but if you were, which side has more modern, ready to use, stronger military?
So a couple factors here. One is that India is a much larger military and a much larger economy, much larger economy. But India is sort of a democracy that needs to answer to other needs of it's the world's largest population. Pakistan, the military plays such a central role in running that country that sort of it spends an outsized amount on the military for a poor country. So it has spent a lot to sort of bring up its military capabilities. It is in the past 2 or 3 decades, in particular, Pakistan has added to its Air Force fleet, especially in aligning with sort of in the war against terror with the United States and using that opportunity to buy F-16s from the U.S. Even during the Cold War, it used that alliance sort of with the U.S. to bolster its military. So India has been buying a lot of new equipment from France, from the United States, from Israel. So in the past few years, we've seen a lot of further investment in modernizing its equipment. But what we've seen is a change of dynamics and alliances in the region. India's military used to be heavily dependent on Russian equipment. That we've seen have gone down almost by half in the past 4 or 5 years. Instead, we've seen an increase of India's purchases from the US, France, and other Western allies. On the Pakistani side, which used to be heavily dependent on American equipment, we've seen in recent years that has almost completely dried out. And about 80% of Pakistan's military purchases over the past few years have come from China. So a major factor in this escalation is to see how the regional dynamics and the alliances have been shifting dramatically in recent years compared to the historic patterns.